The night was heavy with music, laughter, and the endless clinking of champagne glasses. The mansion stood like a palace on the edge of Lagos Island, its marble floors reflecting the golden lights that hung from crystal chandeliers. Outside, rows of exotic cars stretched along the driveway, symbols of power, symbols of wealth, symbols of a world only a handful could enter. That evening marked the young billionaire's greatest triumph. After months of ruthless negotiations, international flights, and sleepless nights in boardrooms, he had closed a deal worth billions. The city whispered his name with both admiration and envy. He was not just wealthy, he was untouchable, a king among men. And so, the party was his crown. Politicians in their agbadas, foreign investors in their tailored suits, socialites in glittering dresses, all had come to bask in his glory. The air was heavy with perfume, sweat, and ambition. Every smile carried a hidden agenda, every toast an attempt to be remembered. But amid the grandeur, the billionaire's soul was tired. Success, as intoxicating as it was, carried a loneliness that no applause could cure. He smiled for the cameras, raised his glass when expected, and laughed at jokes he barely heard. Yet beneath the tuxedo and the flawless image, he felt strangely hollow. As the hours passed, alcohol became his refuge. Glass after glass, his mind drifted into haze. The music grew louder, the lights brighter, the faces blurrier. By midnight, he was stumbling through the corridors of his mansion, searching for quiet, searching for escape. And then fate led him astray. At the far end of a dimly lit hallway, he pushed open a door he thought was his own. But it was not his bedroom. It was hers, the maid's room. Small, modest, with plain curtains and the faint scent of soap. She had been asleep, her world so far removed from the noise of the party. But when the door creaked open, her eyes widened. In that fragile silence, two worlds collided. The billionaire, in his drunken state, should have left. He should have turned back, returned to the glamour and the safety of forgetting. But something in her gaze held him. She was startled, yes, but not afraid. There was tenderness there, a quiet strength he had never noticed before. For the first time that night, he felt seen, not as the billionaire, not as the untouchable figure society worshipped, but as a man. What followed was reckless, unplanned, but undeniably human. Their bodies found each other in the dim light, a tangle of need and vulnerability. For him, it was an escape. For her, it was the culmination of feelings she had buried deep, admiration that had long turned into love. She gave herself to him, not because of his wealth, not because of his power, but because her heart, against all odds, belonged to him. By dawn, the spell had broken. The billionaire awoke with a pounding head and a flood of regret. The maid lay beside him, her face serene, almost glowing. But he could not bear the weight of what had happened. To him, it was a mistake, a night never meant to exist. He dressed in silence, avoiding her eyes, and left without a word. For the maid, however, it was different. That night was not shame. It was not regret. It was love, fragile yet real. She had tasted a world beyond her reach, and though she knew the consequences could be harsh, her heart whispered that it meant something. But the world is rarely kind to such secrets. Unbeknownst to them, someone else had seen. Among the many guests that night was a young socialite, beautiful, ambitious, and hungry for power. She had long set her sights on the billionaire. To her, he was not just a man. He was a prize, a gateway into the empire she craved. And when she saw him slip quietly into the maid's quarters, suspicion sharpened her gaze. Later, when he failed to emerge until dawn, she knew enough to keep the knowledge close. Secrets, after all, are weapons. The days that followed returned to normalcy, at least on the surface. The billionaire buried himself in meetings, interviews, and charity appearances, as though nothing had happened. Whenever he passed the maid in the hallways, he averted his eyes, his silence louder than any words. To him, forgetting was survival. But to her, forgetting was impossible. Every glance, every brush of his presence stirred something deeper. And then came the discovery that changed everything. She was pregnant. Her world turned upside down. Fear gripped her, fear of losing her job, of disgrace, of raising a child alone. Yet beneath the fear was a quiet joy, a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, love could be born from the chaos of that night. Still, she kept her secret close. For the billionaire, the days stretched into weeks, and guilt gnawed at him. He told himself it was nothing, that she was nothing. But in the quiet of his nights, her face haunted him. He drowned himself in work, in travel, in endless distractions. Yet the more he avoided her, the more he felt her presence like a shadow he could never escape. Meanwhile, the socialite sharpened her knife. She watched closely, waiting for her moment. She knew ambition was not enough, timing was everything. With the patience of a predator, she bided her time, knowing the secret she carried could destroy not just the maid, but the billionaire himself. The stage was set. The night of passion had sown its seed. Love, betrayal, and consequences lay waiting in the shadows. And as Lagos whispered the billionaire's name with envy, none knew that behind the iron gates of his mansion, his perfect life had already begun to crack. The weeks after the night of passion unfolded like a slow-burning storm. The mansion returned to its rhythm of power, parties, and prestige, but beneath the polished surface, cracks widened in silence. The maid moved with the same quiet grace she always had, but inside her, everything had changed. She carried within her a secret far greater than her station, a life forming in silence, a heartbeat she could feel even before the doctors confirmed it. Pregnancy had come like a whisper in the dark, and though her hands trembled, her heart pulsed with a fragile sense of joy. Every morning, she woke earlier than before, staring at herself in the mirror, tracing the faint changes in her body. The nausea, the fatigue, the sudden waves of tears she could not explain, they were all signs of the life she carried. She thought of the billionaire constantly. His absence, his avoidance, his refusal to meet her eyes in the corridors, it pierced her deeply, but she told herself that one day he would understand. She clung to hope the way the poor cling to prayer, desperately, faithfully, stubbornly. But the world around her was not made of hope. It was made of envy, ambition, and power. The young socialite who had seen him slip into the maid's quarters that night carried the secret like fire in her veins. Her obsession with the billionaire had only grown. To her, he was not just a man, he was the crown jewel of Lagos society, the perfect husband to secure her throne. His wealth, his name, his empire, all of it was supposed to be hers. And yet, a maid, a nobody, had been chosen, even if only for one drunken night. Jealousy gnawed at her. It was not enough to win him. She had to destroy the one who had dared to touch what was hers. The billionaire, meanwhile, busied himself with work as though money could erase memory. He signed contracts, traveled abroad, smiled for cameras, and presented himself as the perfect fiancé. For yes, he was engaged. His betrothal to the daughter of another billionaire had been announced months before, a union of power and prestige that newspapers called a marriage of empires. His fiancée was beautiful, polished, and dignified, the kind of woman society admired. Yet behind the elegant smiles and public hand-holding, there was no love, only obligation. She was a deal he could not afford to lose. And so, he buried the maid deep in his silence. But secrets, like seeds, do not stay buried forever. The maid's pregnancy grew harder to hide. Loose uniforms gave way to subtle curves. Her once boundless energy waned. She worked through exhaustion, often sneaking away to rest when nausea overcame her. The other staff began to notice, whispering in corners, casting glances that burned hotter each day. The socialite needed no further proof. She saw the swelling beneath the maid's dress, the tiredness in her eyes. She knew exactly what it meant, and she waited for her moment to strike. It came during a grand gala, hosted in the very mansion that had birthed the scandal. The halls gleamed with luxury, red carpets rolled across marble floors, chandeliers bathed the guests in golden light, and music swelled from a live orchestra. Everyone who was anyone in Lagos was there. Politicians, business tycoons, celebrities, all gathered to celebrate the billionaire's engagement. The maid worked quietly that night, serving wine and carrying trays as though she were invisible. But her heart pounded. She avoided looking at him, avoided the gaze of the socialite, avoided the whispers she felt brushing her back like cold wind. And then, at the height of the evening, as the billionaire and his fiancée stood side by side, toasting to their future, the socialite struck. With a smile as sharp as a blade, she stepped forward. Her voice rang out, cutting through the music, clear enough for all to hear. She congratulated the couple, her words dripping with sweetness, before turning to the crowd with a revelation that silenced the hall. She spoke of a secret, a night, a betrayal hidden within the mansion's walls. She spoke of the maid, pregnant with the billionaire's child. Gasps rippled across the room. Glasses shattered as hands trembled. The billionaire froze, his face draining of color. His fiancée turned to him, her eyes wide with horror and disbelief. And in that single moment, the perfect life he had built collapsed. The maid stood frozen, the tray slipping from her hands, shattering across the floor. Every eye turned to her, burning with judgment. The whispers rose into a storm. Shame crashed over her like a wave. The fiancé, humiliated before the entire city, fled in tears. Her father, a man of towering influence, stepped forward with fury etched across his face. His voice thundered through the hall as he swore vengeance. He would destroy the young billionaire's empire, tear apart his deals, and ruin his name. No one humiliated his family and survived. The billionaire tried to speak, tried to defend himself, but words failed him. The weight of his silence, the months of avoidance, the refusal to face the truth, crushed him now. He reached for the maid, but she pulled away, tears streaming down her face. The mansion that had once sheltered her now felt like a prison. She ran, past the glittering guests, past the whispers, past the shame that clung to her like chains. And she did not return. That night, the billionaire lost everything. His engagement collapsed, his alliances shattered, and his empire trembled under the weight of powerful enemies. But what cut deepest was not the rage of his fiancée's father, nor the humiliation of society's whispers. It was the absence of the maid, the woman he had tried so hard to forget, only to realize too late that she had been unforgettable all along. For weeks he searched in vain. She was gone, vanished into the vastness of the city, carrying with her not only his child but the fragile possibility of redemption. The mansion grew silent. The laughter of the gala was replaced by whispers of disgrace. The billionaire, once the envy of Lagos, now carried the face of scandal. But beneath the ruin of reputation lay a deeper ruin, the ache of a man who had lost the only woman who had truly seen him. And so began his search. A journey not of power, not of wealth, but of love, the kind of love born in mistakes, tested by betrayal, and forged in fire. But love, as he was about to learn, would not come easily. The mansion no longer glowed with laughter. Once, it had been the crown of Lagos Island, alive with power and admiration. Now, its halls echoed with silence. The chandeliers still sparkled, but they reflected emptiness. The grand piano sat untouched, the long dining table stretched barren, and the man who had once been hailed as the city's golden sun now walked its corridors like a ghost. The scandal had broken him. The engagement was over. His former fiancée's father, wielding influence like a weapon, quietly pulled the strings that held his empire together. Contracts were cancelled. Partners withdrew. Politicians who once smiled at him in public now crossed the street to avoid him. But worse than the fall of his empire was the void she left behind. The maid, the woman whose touch had undone him, whose quiet strength had lingered in his heart despite his attempts to forget. She had vanished from the mansion, slipping into the city like a shadow. No note, no goodbye, no trace, just absence. She carried his child, his blood, his second chance at a kind of love he had never dared to admit he needed. And he had lost her. At first, he tried to drown the ache in distraction. Work, travel, endless glasses of whiskey in private clubs where the lights were dim enough to hide shame. He convinced himself it was temporary, that she would return, that she needed time. But the weeks dragged into months, and the emptiness only grew. Soon, the silence became unbearable. He began to search. At dawn, he left the mansion and drove through the streets of Lagos with tinted windows rolled down, staring at the markets, the bus stops, the quiet alleys where life unfolded without him. He sent investigators to hospitals and clinics, bribed doctors for records of expectant mothers. He walked through slums in clothes that hid his wealth, searching faces, scanning crowds. Every woman he saw carrying a child made his heart lurch. Was it her? Was it his? But Lagos was vast, and she was determined to remain hidden. There were nights he sat alone in his study, surrounded by unopened letters and empty bottles, haunted by memories of her face. He remembered the way she had looked that night, not ashamed, not calculating, but tender, real. He remembered the softness of her hands, the way she had carried herself with quiet dignity even in her uniform. And he realized something he had never dared to admit before: she had been more than a mistake. She had been the only truth in a life built on illusions. Guilt gnawed at him. He thought of the way he had left her that morning, silent, cold, as though she were nothing. He thought of the way he had avoided her, refused to meet her eyes, while she carried his child alone. He thought of the night of the gala, the shame that had fallen on her like a storm because of his weakness. For the first time in his life, he was not a billionaire. He was not a king. He was simply a man, broken, desperate, longing for forgiveness. Months passed before the first real lead came. One of his investigators, a quiet man who had grown up in the slums, returned with a whisper of news. A young woman, once a maid, now living modestly in a quiet neighborhood on the mainland. She was pregnant, alone, and kept to herself. The billionaire's heart raced. He drove there himself. The streets were narrow, alive with children playing, women selling food by the roadside, men fixing motorcycles under the sun. It was a world far from the marble floors of his mansion, a world he had never stepped into until now. And there she was. He saw her from a distance first, walking slowly toward her small rented room, her hands cradling the curve of her belly. She looked different, tired, thinner, her beauty wrapped in simplicity, but to him, she was radiant. She was carrying his child, his blood, his redemption. He wanted to run to her, to fall to his knees, to beg. But his feet froze. For the first time in his life, he felt fear, not of losing money, not of losing power, but of losing her forever. She noticed him. Their eyes met. Her steps faltered, her breath caught. For a moment, the world stilled. And then she turned away. She walked past him, entered her small room, and closed the door. The rejection cut deeper than any scandal. But he did not leave. For days, he returned, waiting outside, sometimes standing, sometimes sitting in his car. She ignored him. She passed him as though he were invisible. She bought food at the roadside and walked back without a glance. Her silence was not just anger, it was a wall built from months of abandonment, betrayal, and shame. Still he persisted. Slowly, his presence became part of her life. He followed her to the clinic, where doctors checked the baby's heartbeat. He paid quietly for her appointments, for her medicines, leaving the receipts unsigned. When the landlord threatened eviction, he settled the debt without her knowing. He never asked for thanks. He only stayed. Over time, her heart began to soften. She saw the way he looked at her belly, not with shame but with awe. She saw the way he protected her in silence, how he never missed a visit, how he seemed less like a billionaire and more like a man stripped bare. She remembered the pain he had caused her, the humiliation, the abandonment. Yet she also saw his transformation. One evening, when the sun bled red into the Lagos horizon, she allowed him to sit beside her outside her room. They spoke no words. The silence itself was enough. It was a fragile truce, a beginning. From that moment, he became part of her journey. He went with her to clinics, carried bags for her when the weight became too much, stayed awake during her restless nights. He did not push, did not demand forgiveness, did not force love. He simply remained. And slowly, she began to let him in. The child became their bridge. Every heartbeat they heard at the clinic, every kick she felt in her womb, every anxious night they shared drew them closer. The billionaire discovered a tenderness within himself he never knew existed. The empire he had once built with pride now seemed meaningless compared to the small life waiting to be born. For the first time, he was not running from love. He was learning how to build it. The world outside still whispered his downfall. Newspapers still mocked him. Former friends still avoided him. But in the quiet corners of the mainland, seated beside the woman who had once been his maid, he found something the world could never give him: peace. The search was over. But the true test of love was only beginning. Because soon, the child would be born. The night was quiet when the first pains came. The small room where she lived was dimly lit, the air heavy with the scent of soap and kerosene lamps. She clutched her belly, her breath ragged, the rhythm of life inside her demanding release. The billionaire was by her side in seconds. He had been waiting, hovering, never too far. When her cry pierced the air, his heart stopped. All his riches, his empire, his name meant nothing at that moment. Only she mattered. Only the child mattered. They rushed to the clinic, a modest place far from the gleaming hospitals he was used to. The walls were cracked, the lights flickered, and the nurses moved with weary determination. But he did not care. He held her hand as she labored, whispering words he never thought he could say, silent prayers, promises of strength, confessions of a love he no longer had the power to deny. Hours passed like years. Her screams tore through him, each one a knife in his chest. He had built skyscrapers, closed billion-dollar deals, commanded boardrooms filled with powerful men. But here, in this small clinic, he was powerless. He could only hold her hand, wipe her sweat, and beg silently that both she and the child would survive. And then, at last, the cry came. A baby's cry, piercing, fragile, yet strong enough to silence the world. Tears streamed down his face as the nurse placed the tiny child in her arms. She looked at the baby, her lips trembling, her body trembling, and for the first time in months, she smiled. It was not the smile of a maid, not the smile of a woman burdened by shame, but the smile of a mother who had just discovered her heart outside her body. He leaned closer, his hands shaking, and touched the baby's tiny fingers. They curled around his, fragile yet firm, and in that instant, the weight of his life shifted. He was no longer just a billionaire. He was a father. And nothing in the world, no scandal, no wealth, no power, could compare to the fire of love that surged through him. That night, as mother and child slept, he sat awake, watching them. For the first time in years, peace filled him. The endless pursuit of success, the fear of failure, the pride that had driven him, all of it melted away in the face of the life he now held responsibility for. The next morning, he made a vow. He would take care of them, not as a benefactor, not as a man trying to erase guilt, but as a partner, as a father, as a man who had finally discovered the true meaning of love. When she returned to her small room, he refused to let her face the struggle alone. Within weeks, he brought her and the baby into his mansion, not as a maid, not as a secret, but as the woman who carried his heart and the child who carried his name. The world gasped when the news spread. The same society that had mocked him now whispered louder, scandal dripping from their lips. They said he had lost his mind, that he had chosen a maid over empires, that love had blinded him. But he no longer cared. Their whispers were powerless against the truth he now lived. The mansion transformed. No longer was it a hollow palace for parties and prestige. Now it echoed with the cries of a newborn, the gentle laughter of a mother, the soft footsteps of a man learning fatherhood. The rooms that had once felt empty now brimmed with life. He carried the baby through the halls at night, stumbling awkwardly, whispering lullabies he barely remembered. He changed diapers with clumsy hands, laughed when he failed, and tried again. For the first time in his life, he allowed himself to be imperfect, and it was beautiful. The maid, no, the woman who had once been the maid, watched him with cautious eyes. Forgiveness did not come easily. She remembered the silence, the shame, the abandonment. But she also saw the man before her, stripped of pride, learning love one step at a time. Slowly, her heart began to heal. Weeks turned into months. One evening, under the glow of the mansion's chandeliers, he led her to the garden. It was not a grand party, not a spectacle for society. It was just them, the baby asleep upstairs, the night alive with crickets and stars. He knelt, not as a billionaire, but as a man who had been broken and rebuilt by love. He held out a ring, not dazzling with size, but simple, elegant, sincere. His voice trembled as he asked for her hand, not to complete his empire, but to complete his life. Tears filled her eyes. For a moment, she hesitated, the weight of the past pressing against her. But then she looked at him, not at the billionaire, but at the man who had stayed, who had fought, who had transformed. And she said yes. Their wedding was small, intimate, far from the grandeur the world expected. There were no headlines, no flashing cameras, no politicians lined up for photographs. Just family, a few friends, and the quiet truth of two hearts that had survived the storm. Time passed, and the mansion grew warmer. The baby grew, laughter filling the halls where once there had been silence. And then, one evening, she placed his hand gently on her belly again. Another heartbeat. Another life. Another chance. This time, there was no shame. No scandal. No fear. Only joy. The young billionaire had once been celebrated for his deals, his empire, his power. But in the end, his greatest triumph was not built in boardrooms or etched into skyscrapers. It was found in the quiet love of a woman who had once been invisible, and in the tiny hands of children who carried his name. And so they lived, not perfectly, not without scars, but together. The scandal that once threatened to destroy him had instead led him to the very thing he had spent his whole life searching for. Not wealth, not power, not fame, but the kind of love that redeems, the kind of love that heals, the kind of love that lasts forever.